Well, welcome everyone. I'd like to join in saying thank you to all of you from around the world who are here with us today to engage in what I think is going to be a great program. My name is Susan Elliott. I'm the President and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us for today's program, Prospect for Progress on North Korea and Northeast Asian Security. So whether it's early in the morning or late in the evening for you, thanks again for taking the time to join us. You know, the issue of resuming diplomacy with North Korea after the failed Hanoi summit between the UK and the US, and the DPRK has been overshadowed by both the pandemic management as well as the rising geostrategic competition between the United States and China. We have a new administration in the US, and the Biden administration's recent completion of its North Korea policy review, as well as the recent joint statement given with South Korean President Moon Jae-in, has signaled US willingness to engage directly with North Korea under the right conditions. So we want to discuss that issue here today, among others. And we've gathered an outstanding panel for the program with experts from China, Japan, the Republic of Korea, Russia, and the United States. We hope to focus today and cover a variety of topics, including major power competition in Northeast Asia and the opportunities and challenges in a diplomatic approach to North Korea. So before we start, just a reminder to all our participants, if you do have a question that you'd like to propose to our panelists, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we will look to answer your questions in the Q&A portion of the discussion. So now I would like to introduce Susan Thornton, who's the director of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy's Forum on Asia-Pacific Security. Susan has led our program on Asia-Pacific security since January 2020. And prior to joining the National Committee, she had a distinguished career working as a diplomat at the US Department of State, including many overseas assignments, and she was acting Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. So she led all US foreign policy for countries of the region, but also knows Russia, Turkmenistan, Armenia, and is a great leader of our program, and I know will moderate a fantastic discussion today. So Susan will introduce our panel of experts, and over to you, Susan.
Thanks so much, Susan, and thanks to all of you for being with us today, especially our esteemed panelists. And we have a great lineup for you this morning or this evening, depending on where you are. This is really an exciting time, I think, to be talking about this issue. And as Susan mentioned, we have a lot of programs at the NCAFP focusing on Northeast Asia. We've had a number of closed-door discussions in the run-up to this public program on security issues in Northeast Asia. And we will be putting all of that together, doing some analysis and putting out a report on both the closed door sessions and the kinds of recommendations and conclusions and insights we get from today's program. So look for that coming up in the future. Let me just introduce our panelists for today. We have first Ms. Tamiko Ichigawa, the Director General of the Japan Institute for International Affairs. We're very lucky to have her with us. She's held numerous positions in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan, and she participated in the six-party talks from 2006 to 2008. And she followed the DPRK nuclear issue at the permanent mission in Vienna to the UN, and then also was at the IAEA in the latter part of the 2010s. We also have with us Mr. Frank Januzzi, who is the president and CEO at the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation. And Frank has a long background in looking at Northeast Asian security, among other positions. And from 1997 to 2012, he was the policy director for the US Senate on Foreign Relations Committee on East Asia and Pacific Affairs, where he worked with people that we've heard of, such as Joe Biden and John Kerry. We also have with us from Seoul, Dr. Kim Ji-na is a research fellow at the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis, KIDA. And as the chief of the North Korea Military Affairs Division at KIDA, she specializes in the topic that we're going to be discussing today, and also nuclear nonproliferation. Dr. Ivan Timofeyev is the director of programs at the Russian International Affairs Council, RIAC. And before joining RIAC, Dr. Timofeyev was also a professor at MIGIMO, the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. He's coming to us from Moscow, obviously. And then we have, last but not least, because his last name begins with Z, Professor Jia Daozhong is a professor at the School of International Studies at Peking University, and his areas of expertise focus on international political economy and the nexus between economics and politics in the Asia-Pacific region. So welcome to all of our panelists. It's so great to see all of you again. And I guess, you know, Susan talked a little bit about the background that we find ourselves in for today's session. Of course, we've had a summit meeting between President Moon and President Biden recently, and the outcome of that summit appears to have been a sort of unfolding of the Biden administration's North Korea policy review. We don't have all of the details, but it's being described as this kind of Goldilocks prescription where we don't return to the track of so-called strategic patience, which some people describe as the approach during the Obama administration. And it's also not the big bang of the Donald Trump era where we just get the two leaders together and try to cut a deal on everything at the table. It's you know, an approach where I think the president has made clear that he wants to have some preconditions and some work done in place before he would agree to any meeting, but that there is openness to dialogue and negotiations. I think there's a understanding that this kind of a process is going to take quite some time, so we need to lay a foundation. And there's also a lot of discussion about working together with other allies, especially in the region, but also other partners to try to come up with a sustained approach. Now, the real problem that we always have is with the people who are sitting in the driver's seat, and those people live in Pyongyang for the most part. And it's very hard to see, and given the recent record, how the North Koreans are thinking about the post-Trump summit approaches to North Korea by the US, what they think about the Biden offer. And of course, North Korea has been shut out from the rest of the world during the pandemic by a self-imposed closure of its borders. So I think maybe for the first topic today, and just for our listeners, to try to give them a feeling for where we're at in the process from the North Korean perspective, maybe you could just give us your view or your thinking about what are the important factors coming from that side. What is sort of the conditions that we find ourselves in coming from the North Korean side? What do the North Koreans see at the moment? What do we think they want? Of course, it's always very hard to know what's going on in North Korea, but we have to try to make some analysis. And maybe Professor Jia, maybe I could start with you on this question, since China has a very long border with North Korea, and I understand is still maybe mostly closed. But what do you think about sort of the positioning of the North Koreans? How are they looking at things at the moment, and what do they want?
That's a very difficult question because we seldom get to hear from the North Koreans. I was recently, barely a month ago, actually at Hunchun, that's right on the border with North Korea. That's where you had the Chinese, Russian, and North Korean borders on the Yalu the convergence there, the river. I was there for, believe it or not, the purpose of conducting, learning about how to increase biodiversity between China and Russia. On the Chinese side, we have a park that tries to save the tigers and what other wild animals. There's some political issues there. What I heard on the trip, what North Koreans want in terms of the traders, and I talked to the locals who are dominantly ethnic Chinese, and also ethnic Koreans on the Chinese side. They wanted the sanctions lifted. The sanctions are very hurting, and to the point whereby I heard a anecdote saying you had diplomats from Europe based in the DPRK coming to talk to local officials on the Chinese side about strengthening or closing whatever loopholes there might be on the sanctions. And the Chinese side simply laughed back, said, oh, okay, we can do everything you want. After all, we have all these other members of the United Nations to deal with. But what if all that leads to no food going to your embassy based in North Pyongyang? Are you going to shut down your embassy and ship yourself back to Europe or not, right? So what I'm really saying is that I do believe there is a kind of shared concern on both sides about the longevity of the sanctions, or what, other than sanctions, do we have any other instruments? Of course, that depends on what kind of goalposts of interaction we have with North Korea. Let me just stop there.
Thanks so much. That's a great place for us to start. Someone that's been close to North Korea, at least in the last month, which is more than I think the rest of us can say. So thanks very much for that insight. Maybe Dr. Kim, maybe we can come to you now and just give us your perspective on sort of where you think the North Koreans are coming from at this point. I mean, we often call North Korea the hermit kingdom, but really in the last year, it's really been kind of shut down, and it's quite difficult to know what's really happening there. I think a lot of people suspect that there's serious privation and pressures going on, but Kim Jong-un appears to be still in firm control. So how do you see it?
Well, in my opinion, the fact that the Biden administration did not publicly mention some specific agenda with North Korea, especially during the summit talk between the US and South Korea, must have been a little bit disappointing to the leadership in Pyongyang. The US has been in touch with North Korea since mid-February, and I'm very much concerned that there has been no visible progress for about almost 4 months. So it is really hard to predict whether the North Koreans will want to save the opportunity to have a dialogue with the US. Because compared to the past, the US message this time lacks some specificity, because Secretary of State Clinton announced in February 2009, well, principles of improving US-North Korea relations and resolving the North Korean nuclear issue, along with other issues, including peace regime. And in November of the same year, President Obama proposed sending a special envoy to North Korea in the wake of the US-ROK summit. So a lot of things could have happened back then. Perhaps the main reason why conversation comes first is to maintain the situation in a stable manner. From Washington's point of view, White House has stressed that dialogue is necessary to reduce North Korea's the possibility of North Korea's misjudgment of the situation and to prevent increase of tension on the Korean Peninsula. Washington may think it is not desirable to put energy on North Korea issues, which should be invested in global and regional issues. So actually, the positive thing, by the way, is that Washington did not come up with preconditions to start working level talks, although there will be certain conditions before a summit meeting. Working level meetings will not be based on North Korea's actions this time, because of the purpose of having working level talks is to fully understand the North Korea's North Korea's true intention about denuclearization negotiation in the future. But even if the threshold for a dialogue is low, well, in my opinion, negotiation itself will not be that easy because the US wants to proceed with more sophisticated negotiations than in the past. So the question is whether North Korea is ready for this. Even if the US shows flexibility in its approach to North Korea, it'll be clear about principled response. And the Biden administration is expected to show a firm response to illegal activities that can be a violation of the UN Security Council resolutions. So the beginning of North Korea-US dialogue is not the end of pressure measure, and North Korea will certainly know that. And hardline measures against North Korea are bound to continue for a considerable period of time, in my opinion. The fact that North Korea policy was reviewed by so many departments means that the interest of each ministry were reflected in this review process, and North Korea will face a very daunting situation, and perhaps North Korea needs time to prepare all those obstacles to overcome, in my opinion.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. I mean, there is, what a lot of people said after the summit that, it wasn't so clear, and it wasn't clear that the Washington was very urgent about working on the issue of North Korea from what came out of the summit. But the Biden team did accept, of course, the Singapore Declaration, which was something that people were hoping for, at least I was hoping for, and should have been a positive signal to the North Koreans, accepted of course, Panmunjom Declaration, and did appoint a special envoy. So, you could read it kind of as a fairly positive thing as well, which I think, of course, President Moon was trying to spin it in that direction. I don't know, Frank Januzzi, maybe you could come in here since we're talking about the sort of the U.S. stance. I mean, obviously, the question really is sort of, the North Koreans have said they don't want to have these working talks with no preconditions because they don't, want to just discuss again the thing they've discussed so many times in the past. But, on the other hand, as Dr. Kim alluded, I mean, most of the countries in the region are looking for talks because it gives us a feeling of at least connection and stability. As long as we're talking, that does tend to sort of keep tensions a little bit more at bay. How do you see all of this?
Well, thanks so much, Susan. And it's really great to join such experts on a panel. We are all struggling, I think, to try to discern North Korean intentions, and there's nothing new in that. That's one of the most challenging intellectual exercises for diplomats and scholars. I guess I should share a couple of things I know about Biden's psychology when it comes to North Korea. He wrote something back in 2001, just after I came back from my first visit to North Korea on his behalf, where he said that it was important for the United States to test North Korea's intentions, and that the only way we could do that was by being open to diplomacy. But at the same time that he was embracing engagement with the DPRK in 2001, at a time that was very promising in North-South relations and held some promise with the denuclearization agreement between North Korea and South Korea. At that very same time, Biden also cautioned me and others that we can't be the nation that tells North Korea what its interests are. North Korea will determine its own interests. And I think that we really must focus on North Korea's lack of interest in pursuing denuclearization if we're to understand why the Biden administration is not more eagerly or aggressively pursuing diplomacy with North Korea. I think North Korea has made pretty clear that right now they're not very excited about pursuing an incremental, step-by-step Goldilocks approach to denuclearization. I wrote about this recently in 38 North. But I think that the Biden administration absolutely remains open to testing North Korea's intentions, and a very encouraging sign that Susan pointed out, they have not attached any preconditions to that dialogue, unlike, frankly, the Obama administration. The final point I want to make about North Korea is that, their isolation at this point is somewhat self-chosen. There are tons of humanitarian supplies, medicines, foods, stacked up on the Chinese border, waiting to go into North Korea. And the problem is not international sanctions, but North Korea's own COVID closure. And while I'm sure that Professor Jha and the sentiment that he heard is accurate, I think many people are hurting because of sanctions. A lot of trade has been restricted because of sanctions. But for food and humanitarian supplies, these things could go tomorrow if the North Koreans were to open their border. I've been to Hunchun, but it was 10 years ago. But that border is populated by ethnic Korean Chinese who want to do business with the North. And some of that business is absolutely sanctioned. So I think what the North Koreans are hoping for is something they're unlikely to get from Biden, which is a kind of a unilateral American statement of non-hostility beyond that which is already included in the various documents that the Biden administration has embraced. The Singapore Declaration, the six-party talks, joint statement, the Clinton, Jo Myung-nok joint statement. All of these documents the Biden administration has basically embraced. But if the North Koreans are waiting for some kind of a magnanimous gesture, from the United States, I think they're going to wait a long time. I think President Biden is waiting for the North Koreans to signal their interest in dialogue.
Thanks, Frank. That's really helpful. And I think the insight into the sort of idea of testing North Korea is very helpful and rings to me very true. I want to come to you, Dr. Ichikawa, because you had experience with the North Koreans, of course, in the six-party talks, et cetera. And I'd just like to get, your thoughts. I mean, obviously, we can come to a conclusion that not any of the parties are very motivated to move forward. But meanwhile, of course, the North Koreans have also said that they're going to be building up their weapons capability. There are a lot of concerns on that front, so we're not able to just stand still. But I'd love to get your perspective on, since you've been, in the room with the North Koreans during a negotiation, how you see them kind of approaching the current set of factors, and including, of course, COVID and the economic privation that they're subject to right now.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for inviting me for this webinar. It's a fascinating lineup of the panelists. So I'll try to answer your question as concisely as possible. I think Professor Jha already mentioned how difficult it is for all of us to understand the internal situation and intention of North Korea. And if it's so difficult for our Chinese colleagues, it's more difficult for everyone else. And because of what you mentioned with the closure of borders, already mentioned by other colleagues, it's even more difficult. We are hearing, the reports of even more severe economic difficulties, even more than before, mainly to three reasons. One is already mentioned, tightened economic sanctions. Second is the pandemic. And the third, which may not have been so much mentioned yet, is also the effect of the various natural disasters of last year. So the accumulation of these three factors are really kind of putting a toll on the economic situation in North Korea. But as I said at the beginning, it's even more difficult for anyone to get whatever information out of North Korea because of the closure of the borders. But regarding your questions, I think we should not forget that even among all the during this very severe economic difficulties, we also see signs that DPRK continues to pursue its nuclear and missile development. North Korea hasn't tested the ICBM range ballistic missiles or nuclear tests. I think they know quite well what kind of effect such tests might have on the US positions. But the DPRK's ballistic short-range missiles, which are already capable or which are already considered to be capable of carrying some nuclear warheads, are there. And they are posing threats to all the countries in the region. So the so-called status quo means that the DPRK continues to kind of progress with its nuclear missile capabilities. So the status quo is not really stand still. It means increasing the threat to the region and beyond. So I think my colleagues have already mentioned, that US government has already completed its policy review, and it's kind of up to the DPRK now whether to decide whether or not it is willing to engage. So I think we'll have more discussion on that point later. So I will stop here for the time being. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. And you raised a number of really important issues. And I think this issue of sort of, the three factors that are adhering to make the situation inside North Korea difficult, and yet, they have determined that they're going to proceed with, threatening behavior and increasing the capability of doing that, really undermining regional security as we all try to sort of coax them out, and the usual dynamic is obtaining, which is that they're going to be difficult to coax out. But Dr. Timofeyev, if I could come to you and just to give us the perception, maybe he's taking a step back, of the whole Northeast Asia regional security picture. I mean, the North Koreans are pursuing, continuing to pursue this kind of destabilizing behavior, at least in terms of their nuclear and missile development. And yet, internally, there's got to be a lot of pressure on them. But we had somebody in an earlier discussion say, in the answer to the question of what do the North Koreans want, the answer was sort of the North Koreans have what they want. They have a nuclear deterrent that guarantees their security. How do you view sort of the North Korean mindset on all of this?
Thank you very much, Susan. Well, first of all, I agree with previous speaker who mentioned the combination of three factors. I mean, sanctions, COVID, and natural disasters. The problem is that it's hard to get robust assessment of the real impact on economy. Well, we can assume that the damage is high, but then the key question is, to what extent does this damage affect political decision, right? Can it be a real spur to stimulate the North Korean leadership to make some steps forward towards their demands of international community, right? So the second trend is also obvious, that the military buildup is on the march. There are signs of improvement of nuclear program. There are missile tests, etc. And well, in terms of game theory, this is rather, though of course this theory has lots of shortcomings, but still, this is a kind of a rational behavior, because well, they are pressed by sanctions. There are a few ways for compromises. So well, they already have the guarantees of their security, but this is the only asset that they can trade in the international negotiations, right? So this is the kind of attempt to raise the price of the shares of this instrument on the market of international negotiations. Susan, I think you were absolutely right to point out that we should approach the problem in the new context of US-China relations. Well, in the previous couple of years, we could observe quite a significant deterioration of these relations with the new White House strategy on China. And well, the view from Moscow is that Biden's administration would hardly change its strategic view on China in comparison with Trump's administration, though the rhetoric is much more, let's say, careful in contrast to Trump's one, but still the whole course is there. And on the other hand, the dependence of Pyongyang on Beijing, the dependence of North Korea on China in terms of economy is growing up. So in terms of external trade, in terms of, well, some sort of investments, etc. So these two trends, I mean, the growing deterioration of US-China relations and the growing dependence are overlapping. Though I wouldn't overestimate the correlation between US-China relations and the problem of North Korea, because, well, at some point, Chinese diplomacy may be very careful detaching the North Korea issue from other issues in US-Russia relations, in US-China relations, of course, China relations, because they are very multidimensional. This is a kind of a multi-layer pie with different layers. Sometimes these layers are disconnected, right? And last but not least, this is about JCPOA and the negotiations of the US with Iran. I think that 2018 withdrawal of the US from the nuclear deal was a kind of an argument for Pyongyang to be tough on negotiations with the United States. And one of the arguments is that, well, even the UN resolution 2231 did not preclude the United States to break its obligations. So the point was that, okay, how could we, I mean, the North Koreans, rely on the guarantees, multilateral guarantees, even under the auspices of United Nations, when it can be broken by unilateral actions of the United States. So that was quite a that was a point, right? One of the points. So now President Biden is trying to revive, to rebuild nuclear deal, and if he is successful, then it could be a signal, a good signal to North Korea, though these problems are very different, right? But this could be kind of a signal raising confidence and raising trust to a limited extent, but still.
Great. I'm so glad you mentioned the JCPOA and the Iran negotiations, because like you, I think, as you mentioned, I mean, it's important that this not be a negative in the negotiations if we can make it so. You know, I don't think we should overstate the case that this is sort of very important for the course of the North Korea negotiations, but certainly it would definitely help to get it done and have it done before we enter into these negotiations, so that we can demonstrate that, you know, these commitments can be maintained. I want to go now to this question that we've sort of danced around the edges of, but haven't really honed in on yet, which is this question of, you know, who is most motivated to keep the status quo? You know, who, maybe a better question is, who is most motivated to not, you know, maintain the status quo as it currently stands? I think a lot of people assume that North Korea might be the one that's sees this thing in terms of urgency, but I just and certainly others have mentioned that President Moon, with only less than a year left to go on the clock, is, you know, and this being kind of a key part of the legacy that he wants to leave, he certainly is pressed. But I think it just would be good to talk about sort of time is on whose side in this discussion. So maybe Dr. Kim, we could come to you first, and because we've got this South Korean domestic political dynamic on this issue as well, which is going to bear out, I think.
Well, Moon Jae-in government wanted to achieve a transition of the wartime operational control as soon as possible. And many South Koreans think the last of the three conditions is the easiest or most difficult one. The first is achieving core capability to lead the combined forces. And the second is having the initial capability to respond to North Korea's nuclear missile threats. But the third condition is having a regional security environment which is appropriate for the transition of wartime operational control. So having a friendly environment is very, very important issue for South Korea. And denuclearization is inseparable from the establishment of peace regime. Indeed, we cannot shake hands with the one with nuclear weapons. That's what former South Korean President Kim Young-sam said in early 1990s. Without a peace regime, Korea has limitations in contributing to the US global strategy. And there are many critical views in the US about South Korea's priority in resolving the North Korean issue. But one should understand that South Korea does not want to spend all the energy to passively defend any threats from North Korea alone. As a middle power, South Korea wants to join actively in the global partnership, and certainly we feel the pressure. So the urgency is felt by many South Koreans who wish to make some positive change on the Korean Peninsula and move on to make some progress in military confidence building with North Korea. It's hard to predict the change, what kind of change can happen in Seoul after the presidential election next year. Both conservative and liberal governments initially attempt to improve inter-Korean relations in our history. The problem actually came from North Korea. For example, Lee Myung-bak government wanted to have an inter-Korean summit, but the sinking of Cheonan-ham and shelling of Yeonpyeon Island changed the course. So if North Korea provokes another a new government with another military activities, then the situation can get worse in the future. So things, what kind of military activities that North Korea will choose in the future may be the key to determine the next step.
Yeah, and one of the things that is going to be kind of key and coming after the summit is this issue of, we've got a kind of a comfortable status quo now because of the so-called suspension for suspension, even if you don't call it that, right? So I guess the question is also on this issue of status quo. I mean, Dr. Ichigawa, you would probably say that we don't have a suspension because the North Koreans are still firing short-range ballistic missiles, but nevertheless, there's a kind of a suspension for a kind of suspension. And I guess the question of, what's going to happen with USROK military exercises is relevant here. But I don't know, Dr. Ichigawa, how do you think the Japanese government sees the status quo?
Yes, I already mentioned a bit when I mentioned the status quo is not really stand still. So the situation is getting worse day by day. And if we look back 10 years, 20 years, the situation is getting worse forever, kind of. We sometimes succeeded temporarily to slow down, or temporarily we believed we stopped the progress of the North Korea's nuclear and missile development. But in the end, we always came back with worse situation every time. So just going back to your question about who is most motivated, I think the answer was given by my various colleagues already, in the sense that the motivation from the US side and the North Korean side are kind of on totally different agenda. That is the core of the issue throughout the process. North Korea is always, concentrating on lifting of sanctions or getting economic relief or some more, even before peaceful nuclear applications. But on the other side, the US and of course Japan and South Korea too, we want to see the concrete progress on denuclearization and weakening of the kind of the less threat, at least for the time being, in the meantime, in a way to achieve the ultimate goal. So everyone is motivated, but in a totally different agenda is maybe my simple answer to your very difficult question. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, that reminds me of a comment that somebody made at one of our recent sessions about the US-China relationship that Dr. Timofeyev pointed out. And I'll come to you on this, Dr. Jia, because I'm sure you'll have a good perspective for us. In that conversation, someone mentioned that the Chinese see the US using the DPRK as a card in the current US-China strategic competition. In other words, trying to play either continue the lifeline to the DPRK or keep the DPRK going, and isn't so interested in denuclearizing North Korea because it sees it as kind of useful as a foil against the US. And in the same discussion, the US participant said that, no, the Chinese participant said that the US is using the DPRK against China, that the US is not very anxious to resolve the situation on the Korean Peninsula because it's handy to sort of have this troublesome nuclear neighbor on China's border. So, I mean, I have to say I'm skeptical on both counts, but I'd love to hear your perspective on sort of China's view of the urgency of the situation. And, maybe if you can comment too on these observations about ulterior agendas and motives for either the US or China or both.
Well, as most of you know, the North Korean issue is probably one of the most divisive issues among Chinese, both scholars and policymakers, what to do with North Korea. And what really turned the tide was the nuclear explosion in 2009, I believe. It really rocked many here in China because there are lots of circumstances that people have written about it. And like I said, even just for pragmatic reasons, China has no reason to side with North Korea on the issue of sanctions. We have to be dealing with the Europeans, we have to be dealing with Japan and others. It's kind of strange for me to hear that the Chinese are saying that the US is using the DPRK as a card against China, or for that matter, China using the DPRK as a card against the United States. Well, people who say that have their perspectives, but from where I sit, I would say the sorrowful situation for China, as a totality, is that from day one, I'm talking about 1994, when the issues first arrived, China, in some ways, Japan too, but China certainly was in reality the permanent outsider in all this. And the North Koreans know that. They do a tremendous job in playing up the so-called China connection. If you recall, the North Koreans had almost a 15-minute video showing their leader flying to Hanoi, Singapore, wasn't it? On a chartered plane, flying a Chinese flag. What else did they want to show, right? But we get stuck. What do I mean by China being made a permanent outsider? The usual mode of the United States approaching this issue is either it decides to handle unilaterally, or it gets a consensus going with Japan first, South Korea second, or South Korea and Japan together. And only after that, either through the media or somehow we get the Chinese informed. We were not even consulted. So the North Koreans know how to play this. And at this point of time, what do? You have a neighbor and you have these, human connections. And we also have this issue of credibility, interest in terms of implementing UN sanctions we voted in favor of. I would think, well, to the extent I do know, for the working level, some of the government bureaucracies, including Ministry of Commerce and whatnot, they they just sort of say, well, what else, right? Earlier, Frank mentioned about the medicine and humanitarian materials on the border, and the Chinese side has gradually figured out, well, it's not really worth it, being recorded as quote unquote being on the side of North Korea. So it's a really tough situation and for us.
Great, thanks for that. How about for Dr. Timofeyev? I mean, Russia, Jia Daozhong just said that China feels itself an outsider on the North Korea issue. I mean, Russia has also traditionally, I would say a lot more even than China, been in that kind of outsider role. But there's got to be an interest, certainly in Russia, in the issue of the whole non-proliferation regime, certainly, and Russia's an active player on the JCPOA for a similar reason. But also just the increasing levels of tension and difficulty, and certainly Russia would want to avoid any kind of conflict on the Korean Peninsula. I wonder about proliferation too, to other, as far as the non-proliferation regime goes, not just the example of Korea, but what Korea could do with its nuclear capability. But how do you see the urgency in Moscow on this issue, and how optimistic or fatalistic would you think that the people in the Russian government are about this issue at this point?
Well, thank you very much. This is a very good question, and I would rather say that the view is realistic, not optimistic or fatalistic, right? So on the one hand, Russia strongly supports the idea that neither missile nor nuclear technologies should be a matter of proliferation. So this is a co-interest, and here we are at the same page with other participants, right? But on the other hand, Russia has less resources to affect the situation. So of course we are the stakeholders. We keep a pie. We keep a finger in the pie, being a permanent member of the UN Security Council. But even in the UN Security Council, our efforts are quite constrained. So one of the ideas, as far as I remember, was that was the idea of China and Russia, was to promote humanitarian exemptions for North Korea, especially in conditions of COVID-19. But actually, the whole idea of these exemptions, supported, by the way, generally, not just for North Korea, but generally by the Secretary General of the UN, well, it didn't fly. So in terms of economy, Russia's role in dealing with North Korea is much less in comparison with China. So in a sense, Chinese friends may feel that they have a secondary role, right? But their secondary role is much higher than secondary role of Russia. Okay, so and getting back to the question of time, who wins and who loses in terms of time, I think that Japan and South Korea are rather losing, because the improvement of capabilities of North Korea is definitely a bad sign. So in a sense, the United States is losing too, having both countries mentioned as principal allies, and also being a potential target for new systems. I mean, this intercontinental missiles which are being designed by North Korea. But on the other hand, I must say that North Korea itself is rather losing, because the situation in the economy is seemingly deteriorating. And what is more important, it's quite hard to capitalize these nuclear and missile capabilities. So you have them, so what? You can't exchange the non-usage of these capabilities for something, right? For the supplies of oil or food, or for the easing of sanctions. So it's simply impossible, right? And the usage of these capabilities is impossible too, because the answer will be devastating for the country. The military response will be inevitable, right? So I would say that that's not a pretty much good situation for North Korea. They are not gaining in terms of economy, and the price of these shares of nuclear capabilities is not growing up.
Interesting. So now, Frank, I want to come to you, and you've got some interesting points that you're making in chat, which I feel free to make those publicly. But the question, I mean, you said that President Biden, is of a view that we should be testing North Korea. I was in the Trump administration for a maximum global pressure campaign against North Korea. And that was a test. I mean, clearly, we pushed sanctions to the limit, and we pushed, all kinds of other things to the limit by a full court global campaign together with, other countries. And what happened? The North Koreans closed their own border and stopped all trade coming in. So, you had a point in the chat about, well, what do we have? What can we do? What instruments do we have? Several of the participants have mentioned this. Increasing sanctions. The North Koreans seem to really want, I think everyone agrees that that's the thing that North Korea seems to be really focused on as far as what it's trying to get, right, is lifting of sanctions. But imposing more sanctions, so A, is it realistic? But B, does that really give you more leverage at this point? And then you mentioned also in the chat the alternative to, more punitive. And I think most people in the government would want to do both, right? Ramp up punitive and ramp up the other possibility, which is increasing the incentives, right? The positive, the carrots. We have the sticks over here. What carrots do we have that we're actually willing to offer? Is humanitarian aid really a carrot? That's always been a difficult conversation. What else is it that we could offer that North Korea wants? So let me put that really easy question to you, and let's get your thoughts.
Thanks so much, Susan. I would say at this juncture that one of the challenges America faces is that too many people in our government were trained, as I was, by a guy named Thomas Schelling, a brilliant Nobel laureate economist who applied game theory to international security affairs. And Schelling's lessons are extraordinarily valuable to understanding the situation on the Korean Peninsula. But Tom Schelling would never have claimed that you can solve the Korean Peninsula dilemma of peace and denuclearization only through the application of his game theory with respect to incentives and punishments and sanctions and rewards. He would have urged us to remember psychology. We got to go back to psychology here. Thucydides said that nations go to war for three reasons: fear, honor, and interests. And of those three, that the interests is perhaps the least important. Questions of fear and honor are equally, or if not more important. And in my dealings with North Korea, I go back to the wisdom of Jimmy Carter. I had the honor of briefing Carter just before he went to 1994 visit to Pyongyang to meet with Kim Il-sung. And Carter asked all of the assembled analysts and advisors at the State Department the simple question: what does Kim Il-sung want? Because after 8 hours of briefing, none of us had told him the answer to that question. And Jimmy Carter sat there in silence as all of us hung our heads in shame, none of us able to answer the question. And then Jimmy Carter said to me, he says, "I'll tell you what Kim Il-sung wants. Kim Il-sung wants my respect, and I'm going to give it to him." Now, I think at some point in time, the United States is going to wise up to the psychology of the Korean Peninsula. And maybe our Korean and Chinese and Japanese friends can help us do that. Trump arguably gave Kim Jong-un what Kim Jong-un most wanted: respect. I think the failure of the Trump administration was its abject inability to follow through on what could have been a diplomatic opening. But I still think that the Biden administration is going to run up against this wall at some point. How do you show respect to a nation that may not have earned it? How do you engage a country that is not eager to denuclearize, and a country for which the pathway of peace is also fraught with risk? You know, in America, we seem to think, oh, why don't they just choose the easy path? Peace is going to be so good. It's going to improve their economy, get sanctions relief, and they can't eat their nuclear missiles, as Dr. Timofeyev mentioned. You know, they can't capitalize that nuclear asset. That's all accurate. But the problem is that for the DPRK, the pathway of peace is also fraught with risk. So it's not a simple, choice for them at all.
Well, that's very insightful. I think we should come back to you, Dr. Kim, to sort of take us down this path of that Frank raises, which is, do other countries in the region think the U.S. has the competence at this point, after 30 years of various, efforts at negotiating with North Korea? Do countries in the region think the U.S. government has the wisdom of maybe a Thucydides, or the competence and the ability to overcome kind of the things that have plagued us in the past, and to take this negotiation in a direction? And what would, in your view, be needed to sort of get us on the next step to some kind of pathway that we could sustain and try to get at least improved security, and in a step-by-step way, which I gather the Biden administration would be open to?
Well, in my opinion, no other country except the US can give what North Korea wants in exchange for denuclearization. Actually, there were unresolved agendas with North Korea over the past 30 years. And these issues include security guarantee and diplomatic normalization with the U.S. and acknowledging the right to peaceful use of nuclear energy, etc. But in my opinion, providing non-aggression agreements and security guarantees, that was the most important issue for North Korea. At the U.S.-South Korea summit, it was confirmed that the U.S. respect all the past agreements, including the Panmunjom statement, right? And that statement said that the two Koreas will declare an end to the war, Korean War, transform the armistice agreement into peace treaty, and actively push for multilateral talks to establish a permanent and solid peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. In 2018, North Korea seemed to believe that end of the war declaration was just a done deal. If that is what North Korea wants, we can treat the end of the war as a political announcement without giving too much meaning to it, so that we can move on to discuss denuclearization while preventing unnecessary discussion on peace treaty until we see a complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. By the way, North Korea has always put forward the issue of security guarantee above any other issues. In April 2003, North Korea demanded non-aggression pact. In 2004, it said all the countries having troops in South Korea should sign a peace treaty, which is a condition for North Korea's nuclear threat reduction. And again, in March 2018, North Korea confirmed this position. the US, I think US can think of some creative way to give some security assurance to North Korea in a way not to seriously change the allied military posture. And the next step, I think, should be well, providing some humanitarian assistance. That can be the first way to do. The food and health assistance will help certainly North Korea, which has suffered so many damages last year. And nonprofit infrastructure support is also important. It's a subject to exemption that can be reviewed by the UN Sanctions Committee. And Kim Jong-un in recent months mentioned that there is a need to connect railways in the East and West. And South Korea already proposed a railway connection project to North Korea in 2018. So a lot of expectation was there. Perhaps we can think of some long-term preparations like cooperative threat reduction project, because already the US and South Korea work on these issues, and there are some working level talks. And denuclearization will require so much energy, so much time, and so much money. So, and this requires a lot of manpower as well. And these can help North Korea improve even its infrastructure, because cooperative threat reduction has includes the idea to convert military programs into peaceful programs, and retraining civilian personnel, and building infrastructure, and providing some other systems. So I think we have to think about some role division among concerned countries who want to see denuclearized North Korea. And we have to talk about identifying demands, capabilities, and selecting priorities, etc.
Well, thanks so much for doing that, for putting all those elements out there in the conversation. And I think, one of the things that has been mentioned already in the conversation, and certainly in the context of the Iran negotiation, is this issue of kind of our credibility and how can we sustain this? Because I think we all realize, right, that, given the past experience, it's going to take more than a 4-year period of time probably to get all of this done. This is a long-term negotiation, and denuclearization is kind of out there at the end of the road. But there's going to be a lot of steps maybe in between. People have talked about having a roadmap. There are some advantages and disadvantages in terms of maybe domestic politics in some countries to having a roadmap and to trying to sort of generate a consensus around it. But maybe, Dr. Jia, we can come to you. I mean, I know China has been a proponent of this step-by-step, kind of roadmap approach. And I don't know how you see, the possibilities for that, and the kind of commitment to that that would be needed to sort of sustain a negotiation. But maybe if you were looking at some of the elements that Dr. Kim mentioned, and putting together this kind of sequencing, how do you see that as a way of going forward? And what do you think the problems would be with that, if you will? The floor is yours.
I speak only for myself.
Sure.
This is very important to
of course
emphasize. I don't really see much substance in this step-by-step proposal out of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs at all. I think it's basically a show of saying we're out of ideas. And that was actually from the start, when China was part of the six-party talks. Li Daoxin made it very clear, let's just talk, talk, and talk. He really had no principles, nothing to offer, no trade-off. And that showed the Chinese weakness. But I disagree with Gina and others on this. I think if you look at this from the point of how North Korea reacted to this, the last thing they want is more humanitarian aid. It's something that shows portrayed in the to the North Korean people about the stupidity and incompetence of the regime. The regime is going to come back. We have to look at this kind of internal dynamics. The leadership does not want to lose to its own populace. You have that informal conversation going on in that society. You just look at the two bridges connecting Dandong across the Sinuiju and Hunchun across the North Korean part of the town. The Chinese built the bridge, upgraded, beautifully done. Who would not want to open it? The North Koreans would not want to open it, because by opening that is an open admission to the, passengers, North Koreans and Chinese, that, well, everybody will be mentioning this is a Chinese thing. North Koreans were simply on the receiving end. So the last thing we want to do is to go back and make them feel humiliated, and they want to come. I'm not saying they need to be respected, okay? Put it very clearly. Because I don't participate in this kind of conversation very often. Let me say it very clearly. This is the point that was sort of I made in no unmistakable terms with a group of folks from Princeton University when they visited Beijing. China has no interest whatsoever in seeing a nuclear North Korea. Why? Once you have a fully nuclearized North Korea, accepted or not, recognized or not, who is next? Japan, right? And South Korea for self-protection. You have a long history. Now, a fully nuclearized Japan or South Korea may not be a threat to China. China has the done thing anyways, it's a prestige thing, or it's a mutually assured destruction. But that's going to keep driving up China's military cost. We already have enough of these factors that drive up our military costs. The last thing we want is a fully nuclearized North Korea. We have no interest whatsoever in backing up a North Korea with the nuclear weapons. But so that's where we're stuck. I think the real buffer here is the North Koreans want us to show acceptance, if not respect, for the leadership. But then from the outside, you have a very powerful force in South Korea, and certainly a strong consensus in the United States. You want to deny that. That's where we're stuck. And it's a tough situation. And this is quite different, actually, from the Iran situation in that sense, partly because of, the Iran has a very different set of neighbors, and Iran also has other capacities, other alternatives to economic survival than North Korea. So we are stuck. We are somehow at the mercy of sentiments of the North Korean leadership, which is, we can say a lot more about that.
I see you nodding your head, Dr. Ichigawa, and since Dr. Jia has mentioned this issue of sort of the security implications in the region and the difficulty of coming up with I think this issue you raised, Dr. Jia, about North Korean perspectives on humanitarian assistance is very important, because we talk about North Korea wants economics, and believe me, in the Trump administration, they put together a video that showed, condos on the beach in North Korea to try to, persuade North Korea that this would be some bright, beautiful future. But it is a double.
How naively Washington, D.C., a foggy bottom.
You can't blame Foggy Bottom for that. That was
I blame you.
That you have to blame the people from the entertainment industry. But anyway, this issue of psychology is very important, and I think getting it right is also really important. And several people have mentioned the various factors. Kim Jong-un obviously wants respect, but he obviously also faces internal pressures. Whatever we may think of the regime, there are pressures there, and he has to maintain this whole facade of the regime and keep face and all of that. And the economic cards, they have a double kind of import for him. So I think it is very tricky, of course, and it has to be done with a lot of nuance. But Dr. Ichikawa, I mean, you've been there for Six Party and other things. I mean, how do you think about then sequencing and coming up with these carrots and other factors? I mean, I would say, frankly, Frank, that the respect issue that Jimmy Carter mentions, that was a carrot, and we gave it to the North Koreans, unfortunately. I mean, and that's sort of now out of the bag in a way, and we don't have it anymore in a way. So, you know, how to think about smartly this kind of a negotiation. And I think the other question that a lot of people have and was raised in the chat or the Q&A was, you know, North Korea has a different idea of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula over the long term than we do, and how much of an issue is that going to be in coming up with a roadmap? So maybe Dr. Ichikawa and then Dr. Timofeyev, I want to come to you and also to Frank.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me touch upon maybe two totally different things here, because, you know, the discussion have been expanding a bit. First of all, based on my own experience in the six-party talks and all the bilateral talks that I had throughout my career, actually, I don't doubt what Professor Jia said about China doesn't want to nuclear North Korea. I agree. I think neither China nor Russia want nuclear North Korea. I think we had this basic understanding. Other than North Korea, neither China or Russia wish to continue to have nuclear North Korea. But the approach and how to arrive at denuclearization, including how to define denuclearization, there had been many different views, but the basic kind of understanding was there. But going back to Dr. Kim's point about the security guarantee, I think I said, you know, getting not concentrating on the short-term small measures, because we always get into this so-called salami tactics throughout the six-party talks, negotiations, and so on. Because step by step, commitment for commitment, action for action, we tended to go down to these small incremental steps. But if we go back to the overall objective of the denuclearization, as I said at the beginning, each time when some negotiation framework stopped or kind of freeze or frozen, and then when we went back to negotiation with new framework or new arrangement, we were in a worse situation than before. And what happened during this period outside the DPRK? I think Dr. Timofeyev talked about the JCPOA, but even before the JCPOA, I think North Korea accelerated its nuclear and missile development after the end of the Cold War first. And then after the Iraq War, just a period of actually six-party talks between Iraq War and Libya's well, not denuclearization, but Libya's declaration and Libya's lifting of sanctions and so on. During that period, we thought, well, there might be some progress, you know, along the way, because Libya was accepted to the international community with easing of sanctions and so on. But after the six-party talks kind of stalled, 2011, now what happened to Libya? And then, as Dr. Timofeyev said, what happened to JCPOA? So each time this kind of guarantee or what kind of agreement was reached was kind of moved again. And the situation probably from the North Korea's point of view is getting worse for them too. So if we talk about security guarantee, I think here our Chinese and Russian colleagues could enlighten us about how they see the guarantee of their regime, their political system without nuclear weapons is probably a very difficult question for all of us. I don't have any answer of my own, but I think that is something that probably they have been thinking throughout. And probably our Chinese and Russian colleagues may have better insight and understanding of what they really kind of are concerned about the denuclearization. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. Let's turn to you, Dr. Timofeyev. You can respond to that or on any of the comments that we've heard so far on the kind of how to structure a negotiation or anything else on what North Korea wants, etc.
Thanks a lot, Chair. And I agree with Dr. Ichigawa, who mentioned Libyan experience. And here I would like to get back to your question on psychology, right? So this is decisions are not being made by machines; they are being made by humans. And the problem is that the perceptions on the North Korea side may be quite different from the ones on the sides of our countries due to a number of constraints. And I would refer to several things here. One is trust, and here I would refer to all of this chain of events starting with Iran and ending with Libya, which can be interpreted by North Korea leaders as something which precludes them from being more open for negotiations, or at least which may fuel their positions of more hawkish members of the government. The second is about the perception of security, and I think this is even more important because for North Koreans, for North Korean leadership, this is not just a matter of national security. This may be also a matter of personal security, right? Neither for America nor for Russia, China, and other members, this is not a matter of personal security. This is a matter of just security, of national interests, well, regional security, right? For them, this is a kind of a personal issue. And the price of mistake for them is incomparable for the price of mistake for for the leadership of our countries, right? These are very different things in terms of the price of making the wrong decision, right? So we have much higher thresholds in terms. We can afford ourselves mistake, and North Koreans cannot. And last but not least, I would refer to such thing as exploitation when there may be attempts to exploit some step forwards from other parties of the negotiations. That was in the past when, for instance, some humanitarian exemptions or some sunlight gestures were taken, but still it had no effect on the final result. So these efforts were exploded, and this is a kind of a normal human behavior, kind of a normal psychology in this kind of games, right? So we should anticipate that this will be a part of instrumentarium in the negotiations in the future. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think the psychology maybe in this particular negotiation even more kind of bigger issue maybe than in some other negotiations, given the history and how fraught it is. But Frank, can I come to you? There's been some questions in the chat and we've been typing answers. So thanks to all of our panelists for reaching out to our audience and engaging with them. One of the questions was about this issue of COVID vaccines. I mean, we did talk about humanitarian assistance and how that's maybe seen as a double-edged sword by the regime in Pyongyang, but certainly COVID vaccines will not be seen in the same way because every country has to get COVID vaccines from the sort of central repositories or from countries where they're produced or from stocks that, you know, have to be sent out to various countries. How do you see this opportunity, the provision of vaccines to North Korea? It seems as though North Korea hasn't really been willing maybe to reach out to get these vaccines so far, but certainly this should provide us with an opportunity. And how is the US looking at this?
Well, I haven't spoken directly to State Department people about the offer of COVID vaccine to DPRK, but I had extensive conversations inside North Korea during the food crisis and the famines. And I conducted several survey missions inside DPRK on behalf of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to supervise the distribution of food aid, American funded, and to inspect World Food Program facilities and biscuit factories and other things that were responding to the famine. And I can imagine that for the DPRK, one of the concerns they will have is what kind of verification methodology will be required if the United States were to provide vaccine and they accepted it. The American public are not going to stand for 100,000 doses of vaccine to be sent to DPRK to be administered to the party elite and their family members. And so I think that one concern will be, what will be the strings attached to any vaccine? What will be the strings attached with respect to transparency and the ability of the international community, to be inside DPRK to monitor the health facilities and the health distribution of vaccine? If all we wanted to do was to drop off a few million doses at Nampo and wave goodbye, probably the North Koreans would accept that. But I doubt very much that's what the United States has in mind.
But that's probably what China has in mind, if they could get their vaccines in, right? And if the COVAX facility was to provide vaccines, it would probably be on terms that were less intrusive, right?
Yes, but I just think that if you look at what's happened to the UN operation in Pyongyang, I mean, essentially they've expelled all of the international aid community. UNICEF is unable to operate. So there's a level of concern here on the part of the DPRK leadership in terms of admitting foreigners into the country, both as a COVID threat, but also just in terms of having eyes on the ground who are going to be able to report on conditions inside the country. That I've rarely witnessed. And so I think the level of nervousness and concern about any foreign penetration, about foreign presence, part of it health driven in terms of wanting to try to minimize the likelihood of COVID coming into the country, but part of it just a kind of a DPRK paranoia about transparency. I think that's at a very high level right now. And if they won't allow UNICEF to operate, that says something about where the DPRK is right now.
Dr. Kim, how do you view this issue? And there was also a question about, domestic politics in South Korea. Do you think that maybe there would be a radical change in the approach to North Korea if the conservatives come into power after the presidential election next spring? Or do you think that the, policy that's been crafted sort of by the Biden administration could be made to be durable and to withstand these kind of fluctuations we see in South Korean approaches to the question? You might be on mute.
Yes.
There you go.
I agree on the issue of COVID-19 aid to North Korea. What actually Frank Zanucci said. COVAX is, as far as I know, it is trying to persuade North Korea to accept monitoring personnel to confirm the proper vaccination is taking place there as a condition for the supply of vaccines. But so far, North Korea has not offered any detailed plan. That means that North Korea seems to be waiting for the international community to supply the vaccine without monitoring it. So it is trying to buy time. So time will tell. And regarding the political environment change here in South Korea, well, South Korea's North Korea policy will be that much different if there is a its conservative party in place. South Korea wants to peacefully resolve the nuclear issue. That's one thing. And the key issue is establishing a permanent peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. That's the thing that we always talk about. And South Korea's policy toward North Korea has been developing sustainable inter-Korean relations through confidence building and dialogue and mutual exchanges and cooperation. And that aim to create a sustainable environment to ensure co-prosperity. And that's something that all agree on. If if there is a conservative government in place, I think for the time being, they must review the old policy toward North Korea. But I already mentioned that conservative government also sought inter-Korean reconciliation first, unless there is a serious provocation made by North Korea. And today, the new leadership of the Conservative Party emphasized first and foremost, the party should be open to different ideas. And I think it is an effort to keep a balance, not to be too far left or too far right. I think the message that we have seen today is that the new leadership is trying to take a balanced policy on everything. So that's something that I wanted to mention.
Great. Well, thanks so much for that. And I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens in the election, obviously. But I don't know if anyone else wants to come in. We've kind of gone through all the questions in the Q&A. We've had very engaged panelists, and they've gone through and typed answers and have a running kind of discussion going on in Q&A. So I hope that all of our attendees have had a chance to benefit from all of that wisdom that's being accumulated in the Q&A column. But I just want to, I think, close it out unless anyone has a burning last comment. I mean, it's obviously a very difficult problem. You know, we've been working on this in various stages of negotiations for, as I say, 30 years. And I think it's very important that we have this grouping of representatives of countries in the region to talk about this issue. Let's go to Professor John Frank for a couple of quick last minute comments. We have about a minute left. Professor Jia.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about the vaccines. Surprised to hear North Korea is already in COVAX, but we should probably not be too complacent about the situation, because the first place to know about North Korean, if there was going to situation get any worse, in the Chinese borders. But how do we do this? This should not be a competition between China, US, or South Korea, Japan, because if North Korea does need it in the society, somebody has to be going in and do the inoculation. That probably is a good time to test the real bottom of goodwill on the part of us when we talk about we care about North Korean people.
Yes, I agree with that. Frank, go ahead.
Susan, I just didn't want the opportunity to pass without expressing my thanks to the National Committee. The National Committee on American Foreign Policy has been engaged on this issue for decades with good effect. And I also want to commend this kind of format of 5. I think that track 2, 5-party talk, is very useful, but I think it's even perhaps time to think about the possibility of track 1, 5-party talks. And I know that the Biden administration strongly has an allies first approach, and I think that's appropriate and fine. But I think that we must engage China and Russia, in addition to Japan and South Korea, on this issue if we're going to make progress. And the North Koreans might not like it. They might feel a little left out. The psychology of feeling a little left out might not be all bad. if it makes the North Koreans want to come back to the table. So I hope that there might be an opportunity to replicate this kind of dialogue in a track one format.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think there are many reasons to do it, and I think it would. I mean, it's been a while too, so we have a lot to talk about in such a format. But I'm glad we could do it here today with all of you. Wonderful contributions. Thank you so much for all of your insights and your wisdom. And let's hope that the North Koreans are listening and that they, figure a way to come out at some point soon. And then we can start to see what it is that they want, maybe. But I agree that with the emphasis on COVID-19 and on sort of trying to get some engagement going that way would be great. And I agree with what Cha Dao-jong said, that it's an opportunity to show that we care about the North Korean people, but we shouldn't be so intent on preconditions that we make it impossible for the North Korean people to get vaccinated. So with that, I'd like to take this chance to thank all of our audience for tuning in and for the robust interaction with our guests, and hope we'll see you again at some point very, very soon. Thanks all. Take care.